With its union of realistic driving and car culture, the Gran Turismo franchise has remained one of PlayStation's most endearing series. Now celebrating its 25th anniversary, the series has managed to build a strong legacy that combines cutting-edge technology with a strong passion for the automobile. On the heels of the 7th numbered entry, then I feel there's no better time to gaze back into the series' past. So on this episode of DF Retro, we're diving into the world of Gran Turismo. From the origins of sim racing to the inception of Gran Turismo itself, all the way through its arrival on PlayStation 2. We even have things like the Gran Turismo 2000 demo released before the launch of Gran Turismo 3 itself. We also have comparisons between different versions of Gran Turismo, comparisons with other consoles like Dreamcast, and what about those HD video modes in Gran Turismo 4? GT represented some of the finest technology in the console space, and hopefully we can do it justice in this video. So, grab your racing wheel, and let's get rolling. When you gaze back at the earliest days of video games, it's clear that many of the early examples were designed to approximate real-life activities such as tennis, bowling, or baseball in a virtual form. So it should really come as no surprise then that during this burgeoning era, developers the world over sought to bring the thrill of driving to your monitor as well. These days, we often divide racing games into multiple subgenres, including arcade racing and sim racing. But during this era, things were different. The simple act of driving a virtual car alone was enough. The goal was to simulate car racing within the constraints of technology at the time, and we saw this take many forms. Namco's Pole Position from 1982 is one of the first racing games that offers a true glimpse of motorsport simulation. The game asks players to complete a qualifying lap before racing on a virtual version of the famous Fuji Speedway. But it was actually 1984's Revs for the BBC Micro which gives us our first real taste of sim racing. Created by Jeff Crammond, Revs is one of the very first games designed to simulate the behavior of an actual race car. From starting your engines, shifting your gears, and dealing with aerodynamics, Revs was not a pick-up-and-play sort of game. It really asked the player to learn the basics of actual racing. While crude by today's standards, this was a very important release for the sim racing genre. In 1989, however, PC owners were treated to something special with Indianapolis 500 The Simulation from Papyrus Design Group. Papyrus sought to deliver a driving experience that takes aspects of genuine racing into account, a true attempt at simulation, hence the name I suppose. I actually owned this game back in the day. The 3D graphics were dazzling for the time on home computers, but it was clear that the team was onto something special. Over the next few years, Papyrus would continue its foray into the world of simulation racing, setting the benchmark with each new release, and sim racing itself started to become its own unique entity. These simulations were supremely interesting, but focused primarily on professional racing, rather than car culture itself. Furthermore, sim racing was primarily the domain of the PC. With their more powerful processors and 3D capabilities, it just didn't make a lot of sense elsewhere. Sure, games such as Fastest 1 on the Mega Drive offered something sim-like for console owners, and games like Hard Drivin' in the arcade at least also attempted some form of realism. But there was a hole waiting to be filled, a space where car enthusiasts and console gaming fans could join together. By the mid-90s, new consoles with 3D capabilities began to arrive, opening the door once again for more realistic 3D driving experiences. Electronic Arts actually attempted to fill this void with Road & Track Presents The Need for Speed, but outside of that original 3DO offering, this series tended towards the less realistic, more exciting racing. The door was left wide open for what would become Gran Turismo, but Where did it come from and why? Well, to find out, we need to start in late '94, 2 weeks after the launch of Sony's brand new PlayStation in Japan. A small internal team known as Poly's Entertainment released a little-known racing game by the title MotorToon Grand Prix. It's basically a kart racer with a cartoon theme, basic but fun. The team was small at the time and headed up by one Kazunori Yamauchi. Before the PlayStation had launched, Yamauchi had contributed feedback to the design of the controller and had a strong desire to build games in 3D for the system. MotorToon did just that. But these were early days for 3D gaming, and the game itself was extremely bare bones. It's a colorful driving game with a small selection of tracks and events, but it's also still pretty fun to play, which is key. Visually, it relies heavily on flat shaded polygons with minimal texturing, while vertices are manipulated to sort of squash and stretch the cars as they drive around the track, hence the whole tune theme. What's interesting about this game is that it includes a replay feature, something Gran Turismo would become well known for. It basically shows the team experimenting with key features in this earlier software. This was followed up in 1996 with MotorToon Grand Prix 2, which was released in the West. Only in the US it was known simply as MotorToon Grand Prix. While the original feels like a tech demo, this sequel is a huge improvement with much more content, better handling, and superior track design. It begins with a cool introduction sequence that blends real-time graphics with CGI for the characters, and features a much more robust Grand Prix mode. You can really feel the team edging closer to real driving even. It may have a cartoony appearance on the surface, but racing lines and proper braking techniques actually help you win in this game. Perhaps more interesting than the game itself though are the so-called goodies. This really demonstrates the team's desire to tinker with the hardware. Each of these modes can be unlocked by completing the game on the various difficulties. The first one is Tank Combat, which runs in the PlayStation's high-resolution mode at 60 frames per second. It relies on simple shaded polygons to achieve this, but winds up looking very smooth as a result. The second game, Submarine X, is basically the board game Battleship reproduced within this game. But what's wild about it is that it supports the PlayStation Link cable, so theoretically one could use 2 systems, 2 copies of the game, and 2 TVs to play it. Same goes for Tank Battle for that matter. A bit unwieldy perhaps, but these are really cool demos. But perhaps the most important one is this, MotorToon R. This mode swaps the tunes for either an open-wheeled Formula race car or a stock car and has the player driving around a track competing for times. It runs at 60 frames per second as well, so it looks super smooth in motion. Knowing now that Gran Turismo was in production, this sort of feels like some sort of prototype for that game. It gives us a taste of what a more realistic driving simulation might feel like. And this is no coincidence. You see, Yamauchi had a strong desire to build a realistic driving simulator for many years, but it was obviously not a small task. MotorToon basically helped demonstrate that the team could build and ship a 3D racing game, and before the second game was released, the team had already been hard at work on what would become Gran Turismo, and that game would arrive in Japanese shops in December 1997. Upon release, the buzz around Gran Turismo was significant. The PlayStation had become a smash hit around the world, ushering in new types of games, often with a broader focus than games of the past. Role-playing games, for instance, had become a huge deal now in the West even. Gran Turismo tapped into this by offering players more depth than perhaps they were used to in racing games, including a full career mode that revolves around collecting cars, passing license tests, and competing in a wide range of events. This persistent progression tapped into car culture too by offering players a wide range of real-world automobiles that would all feature bespoke handling. It was, in essence, a car PG. But there's more to it than that. Gran Turismo was focused on delivering an experience that was closer to a simulation than the more traditional console racing games had been in the past. A lot of research and development was poured into replicating the characteristics of each car, while emphasizing more realistic driving techniques and driving lines. You couldn't just drive full tilt into a corner and expect to drift around the bend anymore. To really understand the appeal in 1998 though, you need to consider the package as a whole. There were already a lot of racing games on PlayStation by the time Gran Turismo launched, and truth be told, I loved many of them, some even more than GT itself, but there's no denying that they were relatively limited, with no more than a dozen or so cars in most cases, coupled with just a handful of tracks. What GT proposed instead was something much larger. It would include around 170 licensed cars, which was simply an absurd number for the time, along with a nearly dozen racetracks to back it up. The content is then distributed among a wide range of events, which provide a real sense of progression that keeps players engaged. Unlike most racing games, which tended to focus more on powerful, exotic, and sometimes fantasy sports cars, Gran Turismo starts you off with just a fixed amount of cash, allowing you to pick your first car for yourself. But rather than starting with a supercar, you instead begin with something like a Honda Civic. The satisfaction in Gran Turismo comes from learning to drive what feels like everyday cars to victory, while also delving into customization and tuning options. GT allows you to spend your credits on different parts, allowing you to tune the car to fit each event, while also adjusting its visual design. It was basically a toy box for car lovers, at least lovers of Japanese cars, which is what the first game primarily focuses on. Now, beyond the lineup itself, GT attempts to simulate the behavior of each car, modeling the suspension, weight transfer, and dynamics of each vehicle, and more, honestly. Sure, it's rudimentary by today's standards, now almost feeling more like an arcade game, but at the time, there wasn't really anything quite this convincing on consoles, and tweaking your car's performance characteristics could result in some unique racing moments. Gran Turismo 1 was a strong start for the series then, becoming an instant success. Between the Japanese release in late '97 and the North American version, Poly's Entertainment transitioned into a full studio, now known as Polyphony Digital. Of course, being that this is Digital Foundry, we need to talk about the visuals next, because it's easy to overlook this from the modern perspective, but there's actually a lot of skill behind these digital racers. So there's basically three aspects to discuss here: the cars themselves, the tracks, and the front end, and I think each deserves a mention. Obviously, the main draw in Gran Turismo are the selection of cars on hand, but that selection is no good if the actual depiction of each car falls short. Keep in mind that the team needed to draw up to 6 cars on screen at any point during a race, while also calculating physics and AI, in addition to rendering the track and, well, handling everything else. When it comes to actually rendering cars, keep in mind the relatively meager capabilities of PlayStation 1. Modelers were limited to very low polygon counts, with small monochromatic textures using lookup tables for color, while contending with the poor quality final rasterization step that produces the dithered, unstable, poorly sorted results you see in most PS1 games. In that sense, I feel that Polyphony Digital did an amazing job with the original Gran Turismo. Despite these limitations, you can actually recognize each car's make and model while racing, even though they occupy just a small number of pixels on the screen at any point. Recognizing these cars is part of the fun, and I'd imagine it was not an easy task to get to the point where you could actually do that. Now, thanks to a community member by the name Leo2236, we can actually examine these models directly from the game data using a model viewer for the original game. What this reveals is rather eye-opening. Cars in the first game are comprised of 150 to 250 triangles. Such a low polygon budget demands very precise manipulation to achieve a rough silhouette of each car. The detail is then filled in using textures, and each texture is stored seemingly as a 256 by 224 page. An environment map texture then is applied to the car and blended into the other texture to give the impression of shiny paint and reflections. It seems rudimentary and simple by today's standards, of course, but this looked really cool at the time. Shiny cars that were actually recognizable. Seriously, if you saw this in '98, it was impressive. Now, during the race, cars also rely on appropriate LODs to reduce the number of polygons drawn as they move away from the camera. The result is something that I feel actually looks really good for the platform. And yeah, even when compared to PC games of that era, the original Gran Turismo holds up shockingly well. Then of course we have the tracks, which face their own limitations. Again, there's strict limits on what can be displayed and how it's displayed. And the nature of a racing game means the camera has to be near the environment while also moving at a high speed. So you need to create something that looks attractive, dodges the PlayStation's rendering issues, but can move at a high enough frame rate. Speaking of frame rate, Gran Turismo attempts to update at 30 frames per second, and it does a decent job feeling smooth for the system, but it's certainly not perfect. The PS1 library is kind of a mix when it comes to these things. You have games like Need for Speed 2, which runs horribly, but then you have games like Namco's Ridge Racer Type 4, which actually looks and runs even better than Gran Turismo. Of course, Gran Turismo itself has a certain trick up its sleeve, but we'll get to that later. So using the track viewer, we can actually take a peek at some of the game's courses and see that in total, without any calling, this track uses less than 9,000 polygons. Think about it, without any LODs or calling here, the track plus 6 cars nets you somewhere just over 10,000 polygons. When you consider that character models in games that would follow in the next generation, such as Leon S. Kennedy in Resident Evil 4, it's kind of crazy and puts things into perspective, doesn't it? But of course, PlayStation could not and does not display all of these triangles per frame. There's certainly visible pop-in present throughout, but I think the team actually managed its polygon budget pretty well. The courses are attractive, they look full and complete while racing, and pop-in really is kept to a minimum, I'd say. When you zoom out, it's clear that these tracks are basically just tubes with scenery placed around the sides, but it's surprisingly effective. Then you have the user interface. You'll spend a lot of time moving through the menus, and many of these take advantage of PlayStation's high resolution mode, resulting in a super sharp image. This very first game basically sets up what the Gran Turismo series would become known for by featuring this world map of sorts dotted with clickable elements, including car dealers, events, and your garage. Loading is also surprisingly quick for a game of this vintage, and everything just feels nicely polished. I mentioned that there was a higher frame rate mode earlier, and this is something I want to talk about right now. By completing either the GT World Cup in Gran Turismo mode or dominating the arcade mode, you can unlock a new option in the goodies menu known as GT Hi-Fi. What is it? Well, essentially, it's a time trial mode that lets you race on Clubman Stage Route 5, Special Stage Route 5, or Special Stage Route 11 at 60 frames per second. Yep, this mode is a teaser of what's possible when you strip the game down to its most basic form. One car on the least complex tracks in the game. But it's not just about removing the cars, they also had to simplify the track itself. In this comparison, you can see how they stripped out most of the background buildings as well as the halos around the lights. You're basically left with the absolute bare essentials necessary to render out the track. You can't even switch to a third-person view when driving in GT Hi-Fi. So it's pretty much proof positive that they could not have achieved Gran Turismo itself running at 60 frames per second on the PlayStation 1. In fact, this kinda reminds me of Namco's Ridge Racer High-Spec disc, which was included with Ridge Racer Type 4. You can see many developers were interested in pushing for higher frame rates before the hardware was really ready. Another thing I want to mention quickly are the replays. We've seen many clips throughout this video thus far that I think speak for themselves, but it's important to stress just how good the replay feature really was in Gran Turismo. It's this perfect fusion of great camera work and cars that seem to behave somewhat realistically. This was a seriously impressive feature and an area where Gran Turismo would continue to stand out over time. Gran Turismo went on to achieve tremendous success and would release across all major territories. One of the effects of this can be felt in the soundtrack as well. In the Japanese original, Masahiro Ando served as the lead composer on the racing music, while Isamu Ohira handled the menu music. Together, they created a soundtrack specifically for Gran Turismo. But in the West, Sony instead opted to replace the music with licensed tunes from artists such as Ash, Feeder, and Garbage, while Jason Page, who worked for Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, handled all the menu music. This was most keenly felt during the game's introduction movie. The Japanese version uses the iconic Moon Over the Castle theme like this. But in the West, this was replaced with a Chemical Brothers remix of a Manic Street Preachers track. It's fine, I suppose, but it kinda lacks the timing and finesse you get with the Moon Over the Castle version, where it feels like the game's introduction was crafted specifically around the music. We'll discuss the game's audio in more detail later as it becomes a recurring theme, actually. But ultimately, Gran Turismo marks a strong start for this long-running franchise, shifting over 10 million units in its lifetime and cementing itself as one of the most popular games in the system. But this was just the beginning for Polyphony Digital. (1982). Japanese design studio, known as Studio Nue, unleashed an animated epic on Japanese television known as Super Dimension Fortress Macross. Macross, along with 1979's Mobile Suit Gundam, basically defined the mech anime genre. These shows were hugely successful, receiving countless spin-offs and so much more over the years, including releases in Western territories. One of the key figures behind the Macross series then is Shoji Kawamori, who helped develop the concept and served as mechanical designer on this and many other projects going forward. But if you've watched any mech anime, you might also be familiar with sequences like this. Christened the Itano Circus by fans, this beautiful aerial choreography is the brainchild of one Ichiro Itano. This dance of death would become a staple of the genre going forward, and it's something to keep in mind. Now, fast forward with me to the year 1996. Sega, Sony, and Nintendo are all duking it out in the console space. And yes, this may seem unrelated, but bear with me. When Sega launched its Saturn console in North America, one of the games it arrived with was known as Panzer Dragoon. Unfortunately, by '96, the Saturn was beginning to struggle at retail. But that didn't stop Sega from unleashing one of the greatest sequels of the era, Panzer Dragoon Zwei. While it would do little to save the Saturn itself, Zwei has remained well known as one of the finest 3D rail shooters ever made. It expands upon concepts that we saw in games like Space Harrier and brings it to the next level. So what if you combine the fast shooting action of a game like Panzer Dragoon with delicate aerial battles inspired by Ichiro Itano's work on Macross? Well, you get this.
ENIAC, the first unofficial intelligence. The enemy has already activated the time shaft. Your mission is to prevent the Alpha Core from causing historical alteration.
This is Omega Boost, Polyphony Digital's only non-racing game. Released in April '99 in Japan, Omega Boost is basically a high-speed mech anime in rail shooter form, and it's amazing. It also ties directly into the works referenced earlier, Macross creator Shoji Kawamori served as a designer for the mecha featured in Omega Boost, while one of the programmers on Panzer Dragoon II, Yuji Yasuhara, would join Polyphony Digital and served as a designer and programmer on Omega Boost. In that sense, the DNA checks out. Omega Boost opens with a deliciously choreographed intro sequence directed by Kawamori himself, featuring a mix of CGI and real-life actors. This introduction, like Gran Turismo, actually features different music depending on region. The Japanese version uses a song called Shade by Feeder.
Okay, you're hot.
Want a souvenir?
Maryland's autograph. Got visual.
Coming through. But I'm going in a year before her first picture.
Then I'll take a Norma G.
Omega Boost launch standby.
Roger that.
The US version uses Fly by Loudmouth.
Hey man, did you pack extra socks?
Yeah, and the family Christmas picture. Control, Omega Boost is ready to walk this bad dog.
And the Euro version uses Dreamer by Cast. But honestly, in this case, all versions are pretty darn good. Omega Boost basically fully realizes the concept of the Itano circus in a 3D action game, something that had never really been achieved prior to this. There were numerous Macross games, sure, but none of them actually managed to achieve, well, this. The feeling of buzzing around in a 3D space, acquiring targets at will, and unloading on your enemies is remarkably satisfying and is backed by an unbelievably high quality visual presentation that moves at a rock solid 30 frames per second. Yes, internet legends have long suggested that Omega Boost runs at 60 frames per second, but that's not entirely true. The menus and interstitial sequences do, but the game itself is just 30. But the sheer consistency of the frame rate is what I feel tricked people at the time. Honestly, Omega Boost is a technical showpiece for the PlayStation, one of the best looking games made for the platform. In fact, I'd argue it still looks attractive even by the standards of 2022. The quality of the particles, the fluidity of the mecha and enemies, and that feeling of momentum, it's really genuinely impressive. Unfortunately, it was also not a huge success and kind of feels like the success of Gran Turismo ultimately left people wondering why Polyphony Digital would even make a game like this in the first place. It's not entirely clear if this was why it didn't sell all that well, but unfortunately, that's how it went. Thus, if you've never actually played Omega Boost, I really suggest tracking down a copy. It's not that expensive, and this fusion of Macross and Panzer Dragoon results in a true classic. However, during the development of Omega Boost, the rest of Polyphony Digital was hard at work on creating what many might describe as the team's magnum opus, the game that would forever alter the racing genre in the console space. I'm talking about Gran Turismo 2. Released just 2 years after the original game in Japan, Gran Turismo 2 is one of those examples of what I might call the perfect sequel. This game builds upon everything that makes Gran Turismo appealing and amps it up to the max. While Gran Turismo 1 has around 170 cars and 11 odd tracks, Gran Turismo 2 offers more than 600 cars and over 20 tracks. The sheer number of events, vehicles, and options is simply off the chart. It's so big that Polyphony Digital split the game across 2 discs, the arcade disc and the Gran Turismo or simulation mode disc. If Gran Turismo focused primarily on Japanese-made cars then, GT2 offers a true world tour with a huge number of manufacturers and models on offer, more than any other game that had ever been made as of 1999. So where do we even start when talking about Gran Turismo 2 then? Well, firstly, the core of GT remains intact, yet better. The world map is now divided up into different regions, with each region corresponding to various manufacturers. Oh, and for some reason it always displays the game's credits here on the main screen, kinda like a movie poster. I think they were pretty confident in this game. Within these manufacturers though, you'll find a mix of new, used, and special cars available for sale, as well as tuning options and even special events. GT1 focuses heavily on mid-range to high-end cars, but GT2 covers the entire spectrum, from ordinary sedans up through crazy vehicles like my favorite, the Suzuki Escudo Pikes Peak Edition. As before though, you'll spend much of your time upgrading your cars, entering events, and winning those credits. Credits can basically be used then to expand your garage while upgrading cars to compete in more advanced events. Beyond road racing, rally courses have been added to the mix as well, in addition to several real-world tracks such as Laguna Seca, which would reappear throughout the series after this point. One of my favorite new tracks though is the Seattle course, which is simply gorgeous to behold and a far sight more complex than anything in the original game. With so many cars though, it can be almost overwhelming at first, but the idea here is to find your favorites, whatever they might be, and just have fun with them. There's nothing quite like pumping millions of credits into upgrading your Daihatsu Midget 2 and then winning a race with it, right? I mean, honestly, this is a huge part of the appeal. Driving and tuning many different types of cars. Handling has also improved since the original. I wouldn't really describe GT2 as a sim racer. I mean, at the time it kind of fit that description, right? But honestly, it's more of what I would call a simcade racer. With the wide FOV option, the sense of speed is also ridiculously high. It feels fast and smooth to play even today. Now, as with Gran Turismo 1, the AI unfortunately leaves a little bit to be desired. They feel more like mindless drones, often bumping into the player as if engaged in a round of bumper cars. It works well enough, I suppose, but this is definitely one area that really sticks out coming from more recent GT games. As a late release for the PlayStation then, Gran Turismo 2 offers one heck of an impressive presentation. The quality of the tracks has been increased overall, while everything else just looks and feels more refined, including the menus, which are gorgeous in the simulation mode. Seattle is also just an impressive track given its size and scope. I love it. Cars, of course, still use precious few polygons, but the effect is just as convincing as the original, and the new environment map texture, which looks like this by the way, is far more impressive this time around. The cars look especially great when driving on one of these night courses. GT2 really pushes the original PlayStation to its limits then, and the side effect of this is slightly lower overall performance. The frame rate is still very playable, mind you, especially for the time, but it feels less stable overall, and there's no hi-fi equivalent this time either. Audio-wise then, GT2 is perhaps the game with the largest number of changes per region. In Japan, the soundtrack is once again composed of original music designed specifically for the game, but in the West, licensed music makes a return, though this time the Western version retains the Japanese menu music the series has become known for. The introduction movie once again shows the difference in approach, I feel. Not only is the music different, but the actual editing differs as well. In Japan, for instance, you get this nice montage of classic footage with this beautiful music ramping you up for what's to come, before it kicks into Moon Over the Castle. It's a classic. But this time, I actually have a fondness for the North American intro, which uses the Cardigans song My Favorite Game, with a completely re-edited video to go along with it. In Europe then, a remix of this song by Faithless was also used, and it sounds like this. So yeah, once again, there's a distinct difference there, which also applies to the in-game music, which also differs between each region. Japan gets a series of excellent tracks composed by Ando-san again, while North America receives tracks from groups such as The Crystal Method, Garbage, and even a remix of Rob Zombie's seminal Dragula, which was the style at the time. In Europe, however, this game included tracks from bands such as Propellerheads, Fatboy Slim, and Ash, among others. So obviously the inclusion of Dragula means the American version is the best version, right? Right? Okay, another thing worth mentioning. the bugs. GT2's release schedule was apparently brutal, and the first iterations of this game actually include multiple bugs, such as the inability to reach 100% completion, issues with cars disappearing from your garage, and certain races being ruined by AI cars that can go beyond the supposed specification limits. Without patches being available, these fixes actually came in the form of freshly pressed discs for future print runs. Still, despite this, even with the bugs, it was well received at the time and kind of still stands as a bona fide classic in my book. Gran Turismo 2 also inadvertently found itself caught up in an interesting situation. It would be one of 3 games supported by a piece of software known as Bleemcast. Do you remember Bleem? This was the brainchild of programmer Randy Linden, the talented fellow behind Doom for Super NES. The idea? A full PlayStation emulator for both PC and Sega Dreamcast, which had launched in 1999 in North America before Gran Turismo 2 itself. In the end, on Dreamcast, it was only ever released as 3 standalone discs supporting one of 3 games: Tekken 3, Metal Gear Solid, and Gran Turismo 2. You basically pop the Bleemcast disc into your Dreamcast, boot up into the menu, then swap over the game you wanted to play. And when you play GT2 on a Dreamcast using Bleemcast, it promises improvements including higher resolution rendering and texture filtering, and in concept it is interesting, but PlayStation emulation was still early during this era, and looking at it now, while amazing that it works at all, the actual result is less than impressive. Well, when I say less than impressive, this isn't referring to the achievement itself. That is actually very impressive. It's more a limitation in the way PlayStation games are rasterized. Mainly, Bleemcast overemphasizes the main rendering faults in original PlayStation games. I mean, in their original form, the low resolution and dithering sort of blends everything into something that feels at least coherent. But on Dreamcast, the low resolution, warping textures just don't work with the bump to 640 by 480 or texture filtering. And worse still, UI elements are poorly filtered and upscaled, so all the menus and HUD elements look terrible. Also, the way transparent elements are blended tends to look a little strange. The light halos in the night track, for instance, take on a more garish look on Bleem due to the way they're filtered and displayed. It's highly dithered on PlayStation, but that kinda helps blend them into the also dithered backgrounds. That said, on the more positive side, you've probably noticed that these replays are going slightly out of sync, and that's due to the fact that the frame rate is actually better on Dreamcast. Yes, there's more slowdown when played on original hardware, so at least you get a smoother racing experience on Sega's console. Looking at it with fresh eyes, I feel like the approach I'd like to have seen would involve sticking with the original 320 by 240 resolution, but utilizing anti-aliasing, if possible of course, or some other method to sort of clean up the overall image without ruining the scaling of different elements on screen. Basically, find ways to improve the image using its original output resolution. That said, of the Bleemcast discs, I think Gran Turismo 2 probably fares the best. Metal Gear Solid, for instance, is missing reverb effects and sounds a lot worse, while the frame buffer effects aren't quite right either, and the whole thing just feels off. Still, there's no denying this was a very impressive achievement. The Dreamcast was much more capable than a PlayStation, but obviously not so much that you'd expect emulation to be possible, yet here it is. Of course, modern emulation has come a long way. A modder that goes by the name Silent or Cookie PL Monster has dedicated a lot of time to modifying and enhancing Gran Turismo 2 using the DuckStation emulator as a base. What does it get you? Well, you can now enjoy GT2 in widescreen at 60 frames per second with LOD and texture hacks designed to minimize visual artifacts. In fact, one of the craziest things here involves the ability to raise the memory from 2 to 8 megabytes, similar to a development PlayStation, allowing the game to render more geometry than it normally would be able to. It's very cool, and I recommend checking out his page on this stuff. Before we wrap up this section, however, I thought it would be interesting to look at what was happening elsewhere in the racing game scene at the time. On PlayStation, while less realism focused, I think Ridge Racer Type 4 from Namco still stands out as the most visually impressive racer of the console generation, with smooth performance and a stunning visual design. This is one of the games that was often teased during the lead up to Bleemcast as well, though obviously that didn't happen. Need for Speed was still around, and Hot Pursuit, the third game in the series, was a smash hit, with the franchise continuing to forge a bond between realistic cars and arcade-style driving. It was awesome. 1997 also saw the first PlayStation release of a Toge game, specifically with Toge Max Saisoku Driftmaster. The series started on Sega Saturn in 1995 and was developed by shooter developer Cave. It focuses primarily on racing and drifting real cars around Japanese mountain passes. If you've seen Initial D, you know what I mean. Speaking of Sega Saturn, the console had basically reached end-of-life status in most regions by this point, but Sega did release Sega Touring Car for the system late in its life, which looks really good, aside from the dodgy frame rate. The Saturn port of Sega Rally is also legendary for its fluid frame rate and impressive visuals. It's interesting to see this contrasted against GT2's rally sections, that's for sure. Nintendo 64 was still around as well, and many developers tried their hands at a realistic racing game on the hardware. The most impressive game by far is World Driver Championship, which pushes some very impressive visuals for the system that I would argue stand above Gran Turismo 2 overall. This one even offers a high fidelity mode presented in ultra wide that looks remarkably sharp. But not all games fared so well on the console. Automobili Lamborghini from Titus, for instance, released around the same time as Gran Turismo in Japan, is, well, legendary for being an ugly, difficult to play game with very little content, an example of what can go wrong in the genre for sure. Multi-Racing Championship from Genki predates both titles and is an interesting look at what was being attempted at the time. This is more of a rally-focused game, but features a number of real cars while following the more traditional model of racing game progression that we saw before GT. Speaking of GT, GT 64 Championship Edition is another game on N64 that features some elements you might expect from Gran Turismo itself, but unfortunately it runs at a very low frame rate and features a somewhat garish color scheme. There's plenty of other rally games as well, such as Top Gear Rally 1 and 2, but the most impressive has to be Rally Challenge 2000 from Genki. I'll explain why shortly, but suffice it to say, this game is doing some really amazing things for the hardware. And honestly, this isn't everything, and I'm not sure I could cover everything in a single video. The rise of 3D capable consoles massively increased the saturation of racing games available. But hopefully this does at least give you an idea of what the racing scene was like at this point, at least before the next generation of consoles arrived with Sega Dreamcast. But yeah, Gran Turismo 2, despite its wobbly visuals, holds up really well even now. It's still a lot of fun to play, and ultimately, it stands out as the grandfather of the modern console racing sim. It's a very important release that forever changed the face of virtual racing. But even at the time of release, it's clear that things were about to evolve.
次世代機の名称を皆様にお知らせしたいというふうに思います。すごく簡単にプレイステーション2ということで正式名称プレイステーション2させていただきたいと思います。
September 13th, 1999. After months of speculation, Sony finally unveiled PlayStation 2 to the world. PlayStation 2 would represent a next-generation leap in visuals, along with support for DVD media and an enhanced DualShock controller. Plus, it would feature full backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1. During TGS, Sony shared demos of future PlayStation 2 software titles, including games from Namco and Koei. But what really caught our attention at the time was this. A demonstration of Gran Turismo running on PlayStation 2. Titled Gran Turismo 2000, this demo represented the next generation for the franchise. It was clear that key improvements were in play, including more realistic reflections and lighting, as well as a higher frame rate and more detailed vehicles. There exists precious little footage of this demo today, but rest assured, it made a strong impact upon reveal, and was often featured in news clips. The thing is, this occurred just 2 weeks after the launch of Sega Dreamcast in North America, and this is where things get interesting. The Sega Dreamcast first launched in late '98 in Japan, but had just arrived in North America as of 9/9/99, and of course, I was there day one. I love the system, but it fell below expectations when it came to one genre, racing games. Sure, games like Tokyo Extreme Racer were a lot of fun, and ran at a smooth 60 frames per second, which looked great, but it was rather sparse compared to what Sega had released in the arcades years prior, and that's kind of what I had been hoping for. The only Model 3 racing game that would arrive on Dreamcast was Sega Rally 2, but this was hampered by Windows CE and runs with a very inconsistent frame rate, along with downgraded visuals. Of course, Sega and others had many other games in the works. Gran Turismo's success certainly hadn't gone unnoticed after all. Thus, just before the launch of PlayStation 2 in Japan, Sega unleashed Sega GT, Homologation Special. Developed in partnership with Tosei, Sega GT was designed very directly to compete with Gran Turismo. Now, Sega were the kings of the arcade racer, but the more complex CarPG progression of GT represented something new. Like Gran Turismo, Sega GT has a full career mode that has you starting with lower end vehicles while working your way up via winning races and tuning cars. Problem is, the game feels somewhat floaty and imprecise to me with the Dreamcast controller, and the sense of speed is somewhat lacking. I mean, let's look at Gran Turismo 2 again. Yeah, it's much less visually impressive, but the textures are what I like to call speed textures, and that they're specifically created to enhance the feeling of momentum, with those almost vertical lines in the texture. Sega GT really lacks in this area, and it uses a narrow FOV, so the whole thing just feels slow. Also, car models fall well short of what was being teased on PlayStation 2, though honestly, they're still decent enough, and they are a big step up from Gran Turismo 2 on the PlayStation. The environments aren't half bad either, just a little sparse. Problem is, the whole game runs at just 30 frames per second, an upgrade over PS1, but a huge step back from what Sega was doing in the arcades, and certainly from what Sony was promising with PlayStation 2. Ultimately, Sega GT, while decent, didn't make a dent in the market, although it did receive a sequel on the original Xbox a couple years later. But games like Ferrari F355 Challenge from AM2 were a much more impressive showcase, moving at a smooth 60 frames per second with beautifully detailed vehicles. This one was based on a realistic driving simulator with 3 screens created for arcades, and F355 showcased Dreamcast at its best. Alas, as you may have guessed from the name, the game focuses entirely on the Ferrari F355. I always thought that this could have been a great basis for a real Gran Turismo competitor, but alas, it wasn't to be. But F355 actually arrived after the launch of PlayStation 2 in Japan, and it's games like this that actually left folks wondering, is the PS2 really all it's cracked up to be? After all, earlier that year, just after launch, Square's very first PlayStation 2 game was released, known as Driving Emotion Type S. And this one is interesting. On the surface, it has some cool things going for it. It runs at 60 frames per second, features nifty post-processing effects including depth of field, and takes advantage of higher color depth options on PS2, enabling some very smooth color gradients and blending effects. Also, for a game of this vintage, the cockpit view is decidedly very impressive, and not something we regularly saw in racing games at the time. And of course, the game has this wonderful Y2K aesthetic with bright lights and a wonderful soundtrack to boot. Unfortunately, it also falls victim to an issue that plagued many first-generation games in the system: the jaggies. It uses the system's field rendering mode, but without any sort of flicker filter or any other technique that was later used to improve image quality on the system, and it winds up looking extra raw and jagged as a result. The car models, while not bad, also didn't feel like a massive step up from games on Dreamcast. But there's more to this than just the visuals. When this game was first released in Japan, it was widely criticized for its driving model, so the original developer went back in to sort of tweak the game for release in the West. And when you first pick up the game, it's rather difficult to play. But then I received a message from someone who has pretty good tastes in driving games, suggesting that I give it another shot. He had written an article on this very subject, and after reading it, I was determined to give the game another shot. Turns out the main issue comes down to the way the analog stick maps to the steering wheel. Typically, when playing a racing game with an analog stick, if you oversteer into a corner, for instance, your first reaction is to press the opposite direction on the stick. Such an extreme movement is not something you'd actually do when driving a real car though, and this game is sort of built around that notion. So rather than pressing the opposite direction, it basically wants you to center the stick instead. Once you wrap your mind around this weird control scheme though, you can actually start having some fun, but it's still pretty tough. But if you look back at opinions from that era, it's clear that whether talking about handling or the visuals themselves, this game definitely had a somewhat negative impact on the perception of PlayStation 2 at the time. But here's the thing, Gran Turismo itself actually kind of played a part in this perception as well, and that actually comes down to one thing: Gran Turismo 2000. Yep, released to the public as a playable demo at the Spring 2000 TGS, GT2000 screenshots and videos were everywhere at this time, and it wasn't necessarily for the best. So what do I mean? Well, okay, so this demo basically includes one track, the Seattle circuit, though the special stage Route 5 data does seem to be on the disc, though not usable. This demo lets players take a couple laps around the track and was basically designed to showcase what's possible on PlayStation 2. Problem is, the demo has pretty serious limitations. It uses a low-resolution field-rendered mode, so it's effectively just 224 pixels of vertical resolution per frame. The background assets are still lacking a lot of detail, with low-resolution textures and poorly filtered foliage all over the place. Cars are certainly pretty detailed, but unlike GT3 itself, they feature opaque windows and somewhat garish shading. We'll actually get into some of these comparisons during the next section, by the way. Furthermore, it feels like it's running on the Gran Turismo 2 engine, at least in terms of overall vehicle handling. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it demonstrates how early this version really is. What makes all this worse though is that at the time, outlets weren't really equipped to deal with capturing field-rendered graphics like GT2000, and the resulting screenshots that spread around the internet were, by and large, absolutely dreadful. Yes, the console wars were still in full effect even during this era, and people were all too happy to use the worst possible screenshots of GT2000 with just half the rendered pixels being displayed. This helped demonstrate that perhaps PlayStation 2 was not as powerful as it had been claimed. But it did hint at a few cool things. For one, it ran at 60 frames per second, which is nice, but it also featured an impressive use of depth of field and heat haze, unlike anything else we'd seen at the time. So it did suggest that PS2 had a few tricks up its sleeve, but unfortunately, it fell short. So while GT2000 succeeded in hyping people up for a next-generation GT game, I also believe it contributed to the negativity around the pre-launch period of PlayStation 2 in North America. Not that it actually had any real impact on its success, mind you. So while screenshots and real player videos of Gran Turismo 2000 filled screens around the world, Polyphony Digital continued to work on the actual next game. Over the next year, racing games continued to arrive. Metropolis Street Racer, for instance, was a huge release on Dreamcast when it finally showed up, serving as the predecessor to the PGR games. The game itself is absolutely brilliant, but I will say that the visuals have aged more than I had expected, specifically when it comes to rendering cars. Tokyo Extreme Racer also received a sequel on the Dreamcast, and this one looks significantly better than the first entry, with more detailed vehicles, better reflections, and even better environments. I love these games, I really wish it would make a comeback. Fall 2000 also saw the release of perhaps the most visually striking Dreamcast racing game, Test Drive Le Mans, from Melbourne House. This one puts a huge number of cars on screen, uses higher quality texture filtering than any other Dreamcast game, and features a surprising amount of detail. It was a noticeable step up from pretty much every other racing game that had released on the platform. The only downside here is that it's limited to just 30 frames per second. Of course, this actually received a PlayStation 2 port as well, which is interesting. Heck, the same is true of AM2's F355 Challenge. It would also receive a port to the PS2 later in its life. But in late 2000, we were living in blissful ignorance regarding the state of the Dreamcast. I actually really like this comparison, as F355 Challenge was definitely one of the best looking games in Dreamcast, I feel. And the PlayStation 2 port, while pretty good actually, is lacking in certain details. The texture quality, for instance, takes a hit, which was exactly in line with the conversations happening around the system back in 2000. So going into 2001, the Dreamcast had amassed a decent library of racing games, and the PlayStation 2 had launched in North America. The thing is, it turns out this demo of GT2000 would actually have the inverse effect of what we've seen in newer games like Watch Dogs from 2013, with its unrealistic trailer shown pre-release. Gran Turismo 2000 as a product was not to be in the end, and it was instead announced that Polyphony's next game would be titled Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec. Just 1 year after this demo then, on April 28th, Gran Turismo 3 arrived on PlayStation 2 in Japan, and along with it, one of the greatest generational leaps in the history of video games. Throughout the history of console gaming, there are precious few games which genuinely feel like a shift in the state of the art. Games that represent a true next-generation leap. Super Mario 64 is certainly one of these games. Metal Gear Solid 2, which actually came after GT3, is as well. Gran Turismo 3 itself? Yeah, it belongs to this elite group, representing, as I suggested earlier, one of the single most impressive leaps in visual fidelity in the history of the medium. When people talk about expectations for next-generation visuals, Gran Turismo 3 is the type of leap they might be thinking of. It's that good. Compared to Gran Turismo 2000, Polyphony made some huge improvements. The resolution was boosted by 50% for starters. It's still interlaced in its output, but internally it now uses a full-frame buffer, so it's much cleaner, especially on a CRT. It also supports widescreen now. Note the massive increase in overall geometric detail. The underpass is just a flat texture in GT2000, but much more detailed in GT3. Same goes for everything else in the city really. They added more model detail and boosted texture quality significantly, in addition to enhancing the lighting in general. Just look at the buildings here in GT2000 versus 3. You might also notice that the windows are no longer opaque as they were in GT2000, and reflections are now of a higher quality, something we'll talk about shortly. As a quick aside, I actually ripped some of the textures out of GT3 and GT2000 and was surprised at the difference. In GT2000, a lot of the building textures are limited to just 64 pixels by 64 pixels, whereas in the final game, these textures are increased to 128 by 128, so basically 4 times the resolution. The point is, the leap in fidelity between the older demo and the final game is something I feel deserves a lot of credit. We've become accustomed to games overreaching visual targets in their pre-release state, but there are certainly times when the opposite can occur as well. There's no doubt, however, that Gran Turismo 3 is one of the first big blockbuster releases for the PlayStation 2. Its release kicked off one of the best seasons for gaming in the history of the medium, really. The months that would follow GT3 were absolutely jam-packed with goodness. So what do you get with Gran Turismo 3 then? Well, the core concepts remain intact, but the shift to next-generation hardware did indeed have an impact on the amount of content available in total. Basically, after GT2's huge number of cars, GT3 scales this back to around 185. Now, 185 cars is still a lot when you consider the boost in detail made possible on PlayStation 2, but it definitely changed the flow of the game. The cars in GT3 feature more than 20 to 30 times the amount of geometric detail compared to the original PlayStation, plus a more robust physics and handling simulation in addition to improved AI. Gran Turismo 3 also contains fewer tracks than the second game, 19 in GT3 versus GT2's 27, though both are ahead of that original Gran Turismo. When you compare the quality of what's being displayed, however, the leap in fidelity is absolutely mind-blowing in retrospect. GT3 offers more than double the frame rate, at a much higher resolution, with loads of extra detail and lighting. It was, in my opinion, the best looking racing game ever made as of summer 2001. Moreover, I think this represents the largest single leap in visual fidelity between console generations of all time. We've never seen anything like this before or since. Later on in this segment though, we will compare with some other racing games from this era so we can see how it stacks up against those. The core of the experience then, the simulation mode, is fully intact with a huge variety of races and events to enjoy. Compared to the second game, I found the progression to be a little on the slow side. It can take a long time to earn credits or new cars, but it still retains that thrill of tuning and winning races. The new menu system though is dramatically better than Gran Turismo 2. It's much faster and makes it much easier to move between the various screens, so that part of the career is greatly improved over PlayStation. The menus are all presented in high resolution and look super sharp, but it's the way they move that perhaps surprised me the most back in the day, especially in the arcade mode. You navigate between the various screens and are presented with these gorgeous 60 frames per second videos highlighting your selection. It's extremely polished, and I think that this is key as many other games from this era, especially from the West, tended to fall short in this regard, with sluggish, often ugly menu systems. Then you have the gorgeous car selection screen, which really highlights the new level of detail made possible on PlayStation 2, and I also love that depth of field effect. For 2001 though, these were simply the best looking virtual cars in the market. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the features then, because you might be wondering what separates Gran Turismo 3 from the pack. I mean, in terms of raw polygon counts, it's actually not that far away from other games of this era. I mean, Test Drive Le Mans holds up against it very well, right? No, this is more about what they do with those resources. So firstly, the cars. One of the key features presented in GT3 are the reflections across the surface of each car. We take this for granted now, but as of 2001, most games simply didn't have reflections that matched the surroundings. Prior to this, the solution to this problem usually involved using a texture that roughly matched the surroundings, blended with the vehicle's diffuse layer. As noted earlier, Gran Turismo and Gran Turismo 2 use this sort of trick to simulate reflections, but the texture itself never actually changes during the race. You can more easily see something like this in Tokyo Extreme Racer on the Dreamcast. In Ridge Racer 5, Namco improved this by using different textures depending on whether you're inside a tunnel or outdoors in the city, while also scrolling the texture to simulate movement. Tokyo Extreme Racer 2 also uses this trick. It still uses a texture like the first game, but this time it scrolls, with the scenery greatly enhancing the sense of motion. With GT3, however, you could now drive beneath trees, next to any road surface or object, and beneath banners above the road, and they all appear in the paintwork. But was it the first game to do this? Well, not necessarily. It's tough to say for sure, but the earliest example that I found appears in Taito's Ray Tracers on the original PlayStation. Check out that rear window. It's pretty impressive, right? It also appears in another Genki developed game, Rally Challenge 2000 for N64. Check out these reflections, they actually line up perfectly with the environment. In comparison, Gran Turismo 3 does more with this effect, but it's extremely cool to see something like this on N64, I think. How does it work in GT3 then? So firstly, the reflection itself is generated using what amounts to a reflection capture probe. It's almost like what we use in modern games, but of course they had to be more selective with their usage given the memory constraints of the time. The PS2 does not natively support cube maps either, so Polyphony uses a spherical map instead, another method for environmental texturing like this. Of course, this didn't stop developers from trying, and Renderware would actually end up supporting cube maps on PlayStation 2. Burnout 3 and Burnout Revenge both use them, for instance. Now, as you drive around the track, the reflection texture on the car is updated every single frame, and this texture is used as the source for drawing the reflection across the body of the car. But it's not just the reflection itself that matters here. Polyphony also developed a rudimentary roughness cutoff simulation designed to vary the appearance of those reflections based on the varying surface properties of each car. You know, the difference between glass, plastic, and metal. It's actually represented here. This is where GT3 pulls away from something like Rally Challenge 2000 then, which only really features it on the glass. These two features specifically explain why GT3 looks so impressive at the time. No other racing game had ever attempted something quite like this. There's more, however. Let's talk about the road surface. In any modern driving game, the interaction of light across a road surface is basically a given. Driving in the sun? Yeah, you're going to get a nice specular highlight on the road. In 2001 though, prior to the launch of hardware capable of pixel shading, this really wasn't a thing that you saw much, but Polyphony Digital sure tried their best to simulate this effect. So check it out. Driving around the Seattle stage, note how the glint of the sun plays off the road surface when the sun is in line with the player position. Basically doing vertex shading with one light dedicated specifically to the stage's specular component. It's not a per pixel operation, but I think it works. Even more impressive are these wet tracks. At the time, this was just an unbelievable thing to see, but how does it actually work? Well, there's two tricks here. Firstly, as was common at the time, the trackside geometry is mirrored and simplified beneath the road surface itself. We saw this in Metal Gear Solid 2 as well, basically drawing simplified geometry beneath the road surface. But what about dynamic objects? Well, here Polyphony uses a render to texture feature to capture the cars, as well as other moving objects, while the lights are represented using textures created to resemble long streaks of light on the road surface. Beyond this, due to the nature of the game running at a lower resolution without bitmaps, the surface itself takes on a shimmery appearance in motion, which, when combined with the reflection, sort of creates this perception of a wet surface. It's this combination of all these tricks together that creates the intended effect. They did a lot with the sunlight as well. The sun itself is a simple transparent texture, but it's used to give the impression of light streaming from the source due to how it's blended and placed here. When driving through certain areas of the track, you also see these faked light shafts used to create sort of a volumetric effect, but it's really just a transparent texture. Then there's the light or lens flares that appear throughout the game. You'll notice these on car head and tail lights as well as street lamps. So you remember the Bleemcast comparison when I commented on the light halos in GT2, right? Up to this point, when you wanted to achieve this effect, whether on PC or console, you typically did so using a texture. In fact, that's how it worked in 1998's Unreal as well. The calculations to make it work also happened on the CPU side. On PlayStation 2, however, the graphics synthesizer can accomplish this objective in hardware. These flares are basically assigned to screen position of each light source, but the fading in and out of the flare is determined by calculating the percentage visibility of the point as an alpha blend value and then using that data to create the effect. But more interestingly, all these lens flares are actually polygonal meshes. The reason for this is simple. During replays specifically, the camera often zooms in on the cars, but the artists wanted to retain those super sharp lens flares. If you zoomed in on a texture, it was likely to break down and appear blurry. Thus, you'd need to use a super high-res asset to avoid a loss in detail, which costs too much memory, especially for PlayStation 2. By using a polygonal mesh then, you can get away with much smaller textures on that particular object, so you don't blow your memory budget, and it looks awesome in action. They used meshes for a lot of things like this, including the speedometer needles, which are also rendered as polygons. Or how about the heat haze, another neat post-processing trick that was brought into the mix by Polyphony Digital. In fact, there's a famous quote of Yamauchi himself lamenting the fact that they couldn't pull this off in HD on PlayStation 3 the following generation. And that's ultimately the key here. Gran Turismo 3 leans heavily on artist-driven techniques like this, combined with the unique hardware of PlayStation 2. It wasn't possible to simulate the natural phenomenon itself, as is possible in modern game engines, so the team found ways to replicate realistic details like this within the limitations of the hardware. Moreover, Gran Turismo 3 is known for its unwavering dedication to 60 frames per second. I was never able to drop the frame rate even once. It's as perfect a frame rate as anyone could ask for, and this is true in both gameplay and replays. The thing is, looking at interlaced capture on an LCD screen, as we're seeing in this video, doesn't really do it justice. You've got to see the game running on a CRT to really appreciate it, I feel. To fully understand the impact though, let's briefly look back at some of the racing games we previously discussed. I think this is kind of fun. So firstly, there's Sega GT on Dreamcast. This is a really interesting comparison because on the surface, Sega GT actually holds up better than you might expect, thanks partly to Dreamcast's pristine video output. But I still think Polyphony Digital's work here has quite the edge. Lighting is key. Sega GT is flat, lacking any of the nuance seen in GT3, from the lack of reflection textures in the car, the exaggerated lens flares in the night stage, or the lack of specular highlights. These are all areas where Polyphony Digital really tried to push things forward. Sega GT is an interesting case though, as it does do plenty of things right on its own, but the flat shading, lower frame rate, and unimpressive car models kinda let it down. They would revisit this though on another console. I also want to compare against Test Drive Le Mans and F355 Challenge. GT3 doesn't share any of these tracks though, but I still want to talk about Le Mans because I think this one actually compares favorably with detailed tracks and cars, plus some excellent lighting and even these beautiful volume shadows. In fact, in some ways, it's more impressive than Gran Turismo 3. It's really only let down by the lower overall frame rate and lower quality vehicle shading. But despite this, I think it stands out as one of the most impressive games on Dreamcast. F355 Challenge 2 is an interesting one as it does run at 60 FPS with pristine image quality. It's lacking the reflections and lighting of GT3 of course, but I still think it compares pretty well. What about Driving Emotion Type S? Well, there's also a massive bump in fidelity over this one, and I think a lot of it comes down to the way, again, lighting and reflections are handled. That said, I have to give credit to Driving Emotion Type S's cockpit view, which is really nice. Full 3D rendered cockpit views like this were extremely uncommon in console games as of 2001. Obviously, implementing this in Gran Turismo 3 would have been a lot more work owing to the huge number of cars, but still, it's a difference worth mentioning. We'll have more comparisons to other games coming up in our next section, but I feel for now, this is why Gran Turismo 3 managed to look more realistic to the eye when it launched. Nobody else was doing anything quite like it. But there's more. GT3 is also the first in the series to support full force feedback racing wheels. This was something previously limited to the domain of PC racers, but now it was an option on consoles as well. It's something that would become crucial to these types of games in the future. Of course, GT3 doesn't support the full 900 degrees of rotation which would arrive in GT4, but it's still very effective and a lot of fun. Even better, GT3 supports iLink connections to allow multiple PlayStation 2 systems to talk to one another. This is basically a FireWire cable, by the way. This could be used for up to 6-player multiplayer, which is neat, but honestly, the real draw for me is the option to play the game with 3 displays at once. That's right, you could use 3 PlayStation 2s to widen your view of the action. Combining a force feedback wheel with 3 PlayStation 2s enabled like this, it allowed quite an immersive experience for 2001, if you had the cash of course. Unfortunately, later PS2s removed the FireWire port, so I wasn't able to recreate this myself, even though I do have enough CRTs to pull it off. I want to briefly touch on the audio again here. GT3 is the last in the series which would feature a completely different soundtrack in each region. There would still be differences going forward of course, but in this case, every track is replaced. Let's look at the intro for comparison then, as we've done with the last 2 games. Once again, the Japanese version gets a wonderful rendition of Moon Over the Castle. In the US, however, a remix of Lenny Kravitz's Are You Gonna Go My Way is used, and while I do enjoy this track, it never quite matched the tone I associate with Gran Turismo. Europe then uses Just a Day by Feeder, which again, I feel like this somehow feels weird to me. Sony sure did love Feeder though, what's up with that? So yeah, hopefully you can understand the impact of Gran Turismo 3 when it arrived in 2001, but Polyphony wasn't finished with that game just yet. You see, in 2002 the studio released 3 more reduced scale versions of Gran Turismo 3, known as Gran Turismo Concept. These are basically cut down versions of GT3 focused on concept cars being shown off at various auto trade shows in 2002. The first release, 2001 Tokyo, features the Nissan GTR 2001 concept car, along with a total of 51 vehicles. It also features a new introduction movie, new menus, and its own pseudo-progression system. In May of 2002 then, they released 2002 Tokyo Soul, which introduced cars from Hyundai to the series for the very first time. This one coincided with new models revealed at the Seoul Motor Show and launched around the time of PlayStation 2 in Korea. Lastly, the final release was known as 2002 Tokyo Geneva, which basically includes all content from prior concept discs but adds a few new models to the mix. None of the concept games saw release in North America, but they are interesting relics of this era that show Polyphony Digital trying to become more involved with the auto manufacturers themselves, almost like a prelude to the eventual Vision Gran Turismo project. Ultimately, it's tough to convey the sheer impact of Gran Turismo 3 at time of release. This is a game which I feel helped start the system's legacy after a slightly rocky start. It looked incredible and offered the depth that Gran Turismo had become known for. PlayStation 2 is the platform where Polyphony Digital could truly shine, and things would only get better from here. Fall 2001, Microsoft and Nintendo arrive with their first and latest consoles, respectively, the original Xbox from Microsoft and the Nintendo GameCube. These two machines boasted enhanced capabilities over PlayStation 2, with Xbox actually standing as the first console to support fully programmable shaders. Yet during this era, I'd argue that each platform had something truly special to offer. You really wanted to own them all. Of course, by this point, the influence of Gran Turismo was keenly felt across the industry, with a sharp rise in the number of realistic, licensed, car-based racing games. This generation is so packed with racing games that you almost need to break them down into subcategories. Some of these categories include arcade-style racing games like Ridge Racer 5 or Burnout, simulation-style games with real-world cars such as Gran Turismo, Sega GT 2002, and Enthusia, dedicated rally games like Rally Sport or Shocks, games based on real motorsports such as F1, and even stuff like Need for Speed Underground, which taps into that mix of realism and arcade racing. That's not even getting into things like kart racers. Honestly, there's just so many games here, there's no way I could possibly discuss them all in this video, even though I would love to. But I do think they're very important when it comes to context. Thus, I'd like to take you on a little tour of this period of racing game history. Let's begin with one of my favorites, Project Gotham Racing for Xbox. While Halo was the title to buy on the Xbox at launch, PGR stands as my second favorite of the bunch. This is basically the perfect follow-up to Metropolis Street Racer on Dreamcast, but with vastly improved visuals. You still have the Cone Gate challenges to enjoy, where you earn kudos for drifting and various other things like that, as well as actual races, where you drive alongside numerous licensed cars and other interesting events as well. It features 4 cities with multiple layouts to enjoy, as well as a cool radio station-like presentation, much like MSR. This game really showcases the Xbox prowess though, with beautifully rendered city environments running at a smooth 60 frames per second. Cars and lighting were a gigantic step up from MSR. The only real visual caveat here is that the cube maps used for reflection textures update at a low rate, so reflections appear less smooth than you'd hope. But overall, this is one gorgeous game that stands up favorably against Gran Turismo 3, which had released earlier that year. PGR would receive a direct sequel though on the original Xbox, PGR 2, which is even better gameplay wise in some aspects, but alas, it's dropped to 30 frames per second. On the plus side, it does utilize actual anti-aliasing, so image quality is a step above pretty much all other games during this era, I'd say. We'll revisit this later though, because it's going to take part in an amazing upcoming showdown. Next up, I mentioned Sega GT for Dreamcast earlier, but Sega actually followed this up with Sega GT 2002 on the Xbox. This one demonstrates that the team learned a lot from that original project, and 2002 is overall a huge improvement. It plays better than the original while offering a unique career mode, plus it looks dramatically nicer too, with an awesome vibe that can only be described as pure sunset. Clearly, the more advanced hardware of Xbox allowed them to push the visuals forward, including this gorgeous depth of field effect used during replays, but it also allows for a mostly smooth 60 frames per second, frame rate wise. Unfortunately, as with Project Gotham, the reflection maps update at a low rate again, so they don't look all that smooth. Overall though, I think GT 2002 is moderately comparable with Gran Turismo 3 itself, and absolutely worth checking out to better understand Sega's history during this era. It also received an online-specific follow-up in 2003, but unfortunately, I don't own that one, so I can't really show it here. But our next one is a little different.
Ain't nothing like a phone, give me.
That same year, Capcom also took a shot at the realistic driving game with Auto Modelista, except it's only realistic in concept, as the art team went for a completely different look. It's cel shaded. And you know what? It still looks amazing. The use of exaggerated speed lines and beautifully crafted textures make for a super unique looking game that is still as beautiful today as it ever was. There's some other neat visual flourishes here as well, such as the shadows from trees when you drive under them. It's not actually a projected shadow per se, it's just a texture, but it's pretty effective. It really is a beautiful game. This one is weird though, because when bringing it to the West, Capcom made changes to the driving model and it winds up feeling like a completely different game. The issue here is that the game was always lacking in challenge, but instead of trying to refine the AI or address it in other areas, they simply made the cars somewhat heavier and more difficult to control. At least that's how it feels to me. So while this version did receive some additional American-made cars and 2 new oval tracks, I actually prefer how the Japanese version plays. It's really a shame Capcom didn't do more with this concept though, as it's such a beautiful game. And how about comparisons with Gran Turismo 3? This one's interesting because typically you hear people suggest that more realistic games age worse than cartoony games. And yeah, Auto Modelista has indeed aged beautifully, but honestly, so has Gran Turismo 3. And despite the fact that it also aims for realism, I think it has strong art direction to back it up. It's possible to deliver a realistic looking game that still maintains a sense of style. Curiously, this game received a spiritual follow-up in the form of Group S Challenge, or Circus Drive as it's known in Japan, for the Xbox. This one goes for a more realistic style, however, so it never really received the attention of Auto Modelista. In fact, it would actually end Capcom's attempts at creating driving games entirely. Technically, there are some interesting things here though. The game actually seems to use shadow maps, which is really unusual for the era, lending the environment some additional depth. The car models are also solid, and it targets 60 frames per second, though suffers from plenty of screen tearing in busy scenes. Again, with the track selection, we can't necessarily do a direct comparison with GT3, but we can still do this. Both games feature a sunset orange urban track. Capcom did a pretty good job here overall, but I still think GT3 takes the crown when it comes to overall art direction. But Capcom was tapping into the Xbox's graphics chip to pull off some tricks that you don't see in GT3. Another neat feature is this though. It uses this bizarre camera option which lets you drive in first person while a small picture-in-picture window shows your car from replay camera angles. Neat. Speaking of shadows, how many of you are familiar with this game? Check out the shadows from this fence projecting across the vehicle. That looks pretty good, right? What platform do you think this is for? While surprising as it may seem, this is a PlayStation 2 game. First released as Axel Impact in Korea and later as DT Racer in the West, you'd be forgiven for missing out on this one given its budget price tag and lack of publicity. In reality though, it's kind of a technical showpiece for PlayStation 2. It features full shadows that are dynamically projected across moving cars, beautiful specular highlight tricks on the road surface, convincing motion blur effects around the edge of the camera, and some beautifully detailed cars and tracks. It also supports 16:9 and 480p. Unfortunately, the downside here is that it's only 30 frames per second, and the rigid body physics model can definitely drop that frame rate even lower. Weirdly enough, the game also features a soundtrack by DJ Tiesto. So if you're looking for some of that smooth, early 2000s trance music, DT Racer has you covered. For those that were around during the original Gaming Age forum days though, you might remember this one as Faf Racer. Yes, it's real, and boy, it's pretty impressive. Check it out. Xbox also received a slew of other games worth mentioning. Apex or Racing Evoluzione, for instance. The main innovation here centers on building up your own garage and crafting your dream car to win races. However, it's not all fiction. Apex features a wide range of licensed cars too. I wanted to mention this one specifically as it stands out as one of the more technically ambitious racers of the era. It features these remarkably detailed tracks with rich texturing, decent vehicle models, and some amazing lighting and reflections. They also use this clever texture layering trick to give the impression of motion blur. It's not actually motion blur, as it only applies to the tarmac, but they basically fade this in on the road surface texture to give it a speed layer, if you will. It increases the sense of momentum. Unfortunately, it's limited to 30 frames per second and the handling is a little bit twitchy. It also features one of the strangest camera angle options I've ever seen. I call this the cube map appreciation view. The camera is basically placed directly above your vehicle, like a Google Street View car, I suppose, making it tough to drive, but giving you this detailed look at the reflections across the surface. Still, it's a cool game and I recommend checking it out. It's even compatible with Xbox 360. Meanwhile, Namco tossed its hat into the ring with R Racing Evolution. This one stings a little because we never got a proper follow-up to Ridge Racer 5 on the PlayStation 2. And it's fair to say that the success of Gran Turismo is likely why. Namco did have some previous experience with more sim-like games such as the MotoGP titles, but still. This one is somewhat unique, however, as the main mode is designed as a story-driven experience. There's cutscenes and all sorts of events tied directly into this. There's a good selection of tracks here, and I have to say the rendering quality of these environments is actually quite good. It runs at a full 60 frames per second as well, as you might expect from Namco of this era. The one major nitpick I have here stems from the third-person camera. Essentially, it's far too stiff, connected very directly to the car itself, so it never feels great to drive using this view. Compared to the Gran Turismo games, it's also lacking in terms of the overall car shading, but the environments hold up remarkably well. This is one of the few games on this list that was released across basically every platform at the time, so it has PS2, GameCube, and Xbox versions available. Also, the GameCube version comes in a 2-disc set including Pac-Man Versus, which is a really nice bonus. The Rally Sport Challenge games also deserve a mention here, bringing one of the best looking and playing rally experiences to the Xbox. It is in many ways the spiritual successor to the Sega Rally games, and it's incredible. The quality of the models, environments, trees especially, and the lighting are all top tier. We're looking at Rally Sport Challenge 2 here, by the way. The original is great too, but I love Rally Sport Challenge 2. This game has such a wide range of environments to race on. It has hill climbs, it has closed circuits, it has normal rally, it has tracks with different weather conditions, it has physics on objects such as grass that you can run over, and objects scattered along the side of the track also have rigid body physics applied to them. It also has a nice selection of camera views, including a hood cam and a pseudo cockpit view with sort of a black silhouette representing the cockpit itself. In addition, the game has full damage modeling, so as you crash and bump into other racers, your car actually takes damage. It even runs at 60 frames per second, unlike many other racers on Xbox, and in 480p. It holds up so well today. I love this game. Speaking of rally, PS2 received a killer rally game by the name of Shocks, or Rally Shocks in Japan, that also feels like a nod to classic Sega Rally titles. As with most of the games on this list, this game also has licensed vehicles. It is a little more arcadey, however, with these shocks zones, as they're called, where essentially when you hit one of these points, you want to drift and do crazy stuff to increase your rank, basically. It fits in nicely with the other EA Sports big games of this era, like SSX. I genuinely miss these types of games from EA. I really wish they'd bring this stuff back. Okay, there's 3 more games I want to mention before we arrive at the next Gran Turismo, starting with Grand Prix Challenge from Melbourne House. Yes, the same developer behind the earlier Le Mans 24 Hours, or Test Drive Le Mans. And this one really shows what they can do on the PlayStation 2. Firstly, it still features a huge grid of cars, but this time the level of detail and quality of the lighting and shading has been amped up significantly since Le Mans. Furthermore, it now runs at 60 frames per second and seems to be basically 100% locked. The quality of the environment rendering is top tier, and it has some of the best camera work I've seen in a game like this. The behind the driver viewpoint camera is fantastic. I'm not one to typically play these sort of F1 style games, and my knowledge on F1 is relatively limited, I have to admit. But the speed of the game and the quality of the visuals on display really showcase what Melbourne House could do. Sadly, after the release of this game, they would only have 4 more titles before the studio was shuttered. Next up, earlier I mentioned Need for Speed Underground, and I want to quickly highlight this one because there is some very impressive technology on display here. Firstly, the developers wanted to achieve this sort of fast and furious look by focusing heavily on post-processing effects, and as a result, the PS2 version specifically includes some very fancy motion blur techniques which still look amazing today. I'm really not entirely sure how they pulled this off. Beyond that, the game uses these planar reflections, giving the roads this beautiful wet surface effect. The car models are great with nice reflections, and everything just looks really slick. The only downside to this one is that the frame rate is capped at 30 frames per second, and even then it can drop below that point. This game was extremely important for EA and stands as one of the best Need for Speed games ever made. The amount of customization on offer here, the awesome soundtrack, and just the sheer volume of events available, it's a fantastic title. And while I understand that Need for Speed Underground 2 is perhaps even more popular, I much prefer the track-based design of Underground 1. Of course, if you permit me to jump ahead chronologically for a moment, there's one other game we need to mention here.
Tjena på! Det här är Sven Retro 2000 och det här är Volvo Drive for Life. Ett exklusivt Xbox racingspel som är utvecklad av den brittiska studion Climax. Det här spelet var utformat för att ge Xbox-spelare en chans att uppleva nya bilar från Volvos utbud i 2005. Den gavs bort hos 8 försäljare i USA och innehåller 3 bilar. Volvo S40, S60R och XC90 V8. När du först väljer en bil får du chansen att ta ut en Volvo på en testbana där du kan uppleva de prisbelönta säkerhets- och prestationsproblemfrågorna, som om när du försöker att undvika att köra in en älg eller ta dig förbi kögullgrinnarna. Men sedan börjar det roliga. Välj till exempel S40 och ditt mål är enkelt. Spela vad som i princip är en runda outrun och ta dig fram till Volvo-handlaren i slutet. Men Sven, jag vill köra SUV, säger du. Inga problem, min vän. Då gör du samma sak, men på isiga vägar när du tar dig till Volvo-hotellet. Med S60R får du delta i en tävling med alla Volvo-bilar. En riktig svensk triumf, som man säger. Du kan också luta dig tillbaka och njuta av crash-testvideor eller lära dig mer om Volvo med den smidiga svenska värld Hans Nilsson. En man så äkta svenska som kavli kaviar. Inget annat spel i den här videon kommer i närheten att simulera nöjet att köra en Volvo som det här spelet, vilket gör det till ett riktigt must have. Jag ger det här spelet 4,5 Gunda Svan. Spela det här spelet. Spela den till ära för alla svenska maniacs där ute. Men viktigast av allt, spela det här för Hans Nilsson.
So yeah, all this stuff and more was happening between the release of Gran Turismo 3 and Gran Turismo 4. It's really just the tip of the iceberg too. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about Forza Motorsport or Konami's Enthusia either. Those arrived in 2005. We'll talk about them then. So, Gran Turismo 4. Where do we even start? Well, we received our first taste of GT4 with the release of the Prologue disc in late 2003. This basically set the stage for the final game, which was originally due in 2003. Instead, it was delayed by quite a while, first arriving in Japan in December of 2004. Gran Turismo 4 is perhaps the largest, most jam-packed entry in the entire series. It's built on the foundation of Gran Turismo 3's engine, but ramped up significantly in key areas. It features over 700 cars this time, which is simply absurd when considering the quality of the models. Even crazier, this game has 51 tracks spread across real circuits, fictional circuits, city environments, and rally tracks. There's just so much content here, really. As before, the GT or simulation mode returns, but it introduces this new menu system which has so many events and features to explore as you scroll around the map. It's clear the developers wanted to pour everything they had into making this game. You still have the license tests, the car dealers to visit, the Sunday Cups to race, and the like, but now you're introduced to new, unique events such as drag racing, both dirt and snow rally, full 24-hour endurance challenges, special cups focused on manufacturers, and all sorts of other weird trials. Beyond that, this entry also introduces the B-Spec mode, which basically amounts to watching a virtual driver tackle races while you kind of encourage them, so to speak. The arcade mode is also much more fleshed out this time, and all the other major features from GT3 return. On top of this, GT4 marks the introduction of photo mode for the series. In fact, it's one of the earliest games I can think of which has this as an option. You can snap an in-game photo, and then the console can render it out at a higher resolution, which you can then save to a USB stick. The handling itself also received a major overhaul, with car dynamics and body movement now becoming much more realistic, though it's not necessarily what everyone wanted as it shifted towards increased realism over pick-up-and-play fun. For instance, you couldn't easily ride the walls anymore due to the increased friction, so it was more difficult to cheese the game if you're that kind of racer. So yeah, it's more Gran Turismo than you would ever possibly know what to do with. Just an absurdly large game by any metric. But what I really want to talk about here are the technical changes. Gran Turismo 4 offers a slew of enhancements over GT3, including higher resolution output support, including a 1080i HD mode, driver animations for open cockpit vehicles, 3D crowds that react to your driving, and larger, more detailed environments with improved textures and lighting. So let's start with the resolution question then. While GT3 seemingly used a 448 line mode for much of its drawing, it's still ultimately an interlaced game at heart, but GT4 actually offers players a choice. You can now run in 480p progressive scan mode, or opt for a 1080i mode. Unfortunately, these two modes were removed in the PAL version of the game for some reason. Now, by default, the game runs in an interlaced mode using 24-bit color like GT3. The 480p mode, though, switches to a 640 by 448 progressive scan frame buffer, but reduces color depth to 16-bit due to memory constraints. This results in an image with more visible dithering patterns and some additional color banding as well. It's an interesting trade-off though, because 480p is noticeably sharper on a monitor supporting this option, but I also tend to prefer the interlaced output on a nice professional CRT due to how it blends the fields. Still, 480p was a fantastic option that brings the image quality in line with Xbox and GameCube titles. GameCube especially, as that also typically ran games in 16-bit color mode with obvious dithering when using 480p output. But what about the 1080i mode? This one is extra strange, and no, it's nowhere near the actual 1080i resolution. Instead, it basically runs at 576 by 480 per frame, but thanks to interlacing, we actually get an effective 576 by 960 instead. So it increases the perception of vertical resolution but slightly decreases the horizontal res. The resulting image then within the 1080i frame is roughly 1728 by 960, with 576 being multiplied and scaled by 3 to 1728, and 480 being doubled due to the interlacing. Also worth noting that 1080i only displays in widescreen mode. It is an inherently widescreen resolution after all. You can do this with 480i and 480p as well, but that's anamorphic and it stretches the pixels. So depending on how your display or scaler does that, the 1080i version can actually look a little bit sharper in widescreen mode. As you can see in the capture, it also uses 16-bit color like the 480p mode. As a result, I wouldn't really call this an HD mode per se, but at the same time, I do think context is key here. On HD capable CRTs of this era, few could actually resolve the full 1080i signal, so GT4's 1080i mode winds up looking really sharp and nice, making it a good choice for widescreen on an HD capable CRT of the era. The other thing to note is that running in 1080i or 480p can introduce some screen tearing during replays, when the screen is packed at least, something I didn't really notice in the 480i mode. So that's basically the score with this resolution stuff, and hopefully it helps clear up this option and why Polyphony Digital included it. I think it's a neat inclusion, and it's one of the only games in the system to actually output 1080i. Beyond this, however, other improvements were made with higher quality depth of field effects, a rudimentary simulation of Fresnel on car paint, and higher quality specular work, plus some of the backgrounds are just gorgeous. I love the Grand Canyon stage. Unfortunately, the chase cam was, I feel, somewhat compromised in GT4 with an overly restrictive, tight focus on the car. Just recently, however, Cookie PL Monster, who I mentioned in the GT2 section, actually discovered how to enable the GT3 style chase cam in this game, so there is finally a solution. Check his stuff out. Still, you can really see that Polyphony was pushing the PlayStation 2 to its limits, and the result is a beautiful game all around. Alongside all of the content packed into GT4, however, one of the new tracks sticks out, specifically the Nürburgring. This famous 20-kilometer German racetrack has become prolific in many racing games today, and a lot of this really kicked off during this specific era. That is to say, Nürburgring is included in several key games from this period, and I feel this track actually makes for an interesting point of comparison. So, get ready for the ringside showdown as we pit Gran Turismo 4's version of the Nürburgring against 3 other games. Let's take a tour of our contestants. First up, PGR2. Released more than a year prior to GT4 itself, PGR2 makes the list due to its high quality visuals and popularity at the time. But this one is interesting because most of the game actually focuses on city-based environments. So how does it fare when rendering a racetrack like this? The next game on the list then, Enthusia, Professional Racing from Konami. This game released in 2005 after GT4, and it's a key release as it's one of the few Japanese-made competitors to come close to matching Gran Turismo itself. It was clearly a big project for Konami. It also has a fantastic soundtrack and a beautiful visual style. It doesn't feature quite the amount of content of something like GT4, but what's here is great. It has unique modes such as Enthusia Life, based around a ranking system and various weeks of races, as well as features to encourage clean driving. You lose points for going off-road or colliding with other drivers, for instance. I also want to highlight this beautiful car selection screen, which has the car spinning around slowly before rocketing up in speed using motion blur so that you can see all the different angles within a certain amount of time. It looks awesome. What stands out about this game the most, however, is the driving model itself. There's this well-known demonstration video that Konami put out back in the day, and as you can see, it's designed to show how closely Enthusia's physics match those of real-world cars. The knock-on effect of this, however, is that it's a very difficult game to play with a gamepad. It's clearly designed for a racing wheel. There's a lot to love once you get into it, but this hardcore driving model and the lower amount of content ensured that it wasn't quite the success I think Konami had hoped it would be. Our final competitor, however, is the one that did find success in a big way, Forza Motorsport. Microsoft has previously noted that Forza was designed specifically to compete with Gran Turismo, and out of every series that tried, this is the one that managed to pull it off, and Forza Motorsport for Xbox is their very first attempt. This one also released in 2005 after being delayed a few times, and it is a late game for the system, no doubt, considering that Xbox 360 was just around the corner. But while it might not match the sheer volume of content seen in GT4, it's extremely impressive as their first entry in the series, with plenty of tracks and 230 odd cars to drive. In many ways, this feels like an American muscle versus Japanese tuner car sort of situation, with its bombastic rock soundtrack and bold colors. It strikes a very different tone, but it works. Turn 10 opted to push hardware features of the Xbox with this game, including advanced shadow rendering, plenty of pixel shader goodness, and even Dolby Digital 5.1 for the sound. Gran Turismo is kind of lacking in terms of engine noises at this point, and I feel that Forza comes out ahead. The one caveat here though is frame rate. Forza is only 30 frames per second, which is kind of funny now because the rest of the Motorsport series has always targeted 60 frames per second instead. This is the one exception. So with our competitors established, let's step into the ring. I want to start here with Gran Turismo 4's version first. When looking at how the track is designed and presented, it's clear that each team took a very different approach. With GT4, Polyphony has opted for a somewhat overcast day with a hint of sun piercing through the clouds. The color scheme is grounded and earthy, and it treats the track with the sense of grandeur it deserves. It's a very evocative, beautiful version of the ring. Enthusia then strikes an even darker tone with a setting that can only be described as dusk before a storm. In that sense, it's one of my favorite takes on the track. It feels foreboding and moody. This is aided by the fact that it features an original song composed specifically for this track called Awakening, Nürburgring Suite. This nearly 10-minute long track is designed to perfectly align with one lap on the ring, and man, it's awesome. Then we have Forza Motorsport, which takes a very different tone as well, with its guitar riffs rocking in the background and the moderately cloudy yet still blue skies above. Forza feels like a cool autumn day on the track. It's very refreshing in that sense. Compared to the others, many of the trees are barren with leaves scattered about the ground, and the color scheme perfectly channels that late October feel. Lastly, we have PGR2, which seems to take place at dawn perhaps, and is the least evocative of the bunch, I suppose. It becomes clear that the strength with this game lies specifically with its city rendering, but it is neat to see how it stacks up, specifically how they tackled the terrain issue. Now, when looking at all four together, it is fascinating. The tone and rendering choices all differ between them. Also, the left side here is exclusively 30 frames per second, while the other side aims for 60. But on the left, you also get higher quality shadows, pixel shader effects, and in the case of Forza, this cool looking motion blur effect around the bottom of the car. GT4, however, seems to strike the most realistic tone here, I think. Polyphony seems to favor the more neutral, realistic look with their games, rather than aiming for brighter colors, and I do feel that actually works really well in this case. It feels very Germany, I can confirm that. This one also updates at 60 frames per second, of course, so it looks extra smooth in motion. Enthusia is the most curious of the bunch though, because technically it is missing some of the more advanced features. It's the only one here that is limited to 480i output and only outputs in 4x3, yet I still think Konami's art direction shines through, and the game offers a wonderful iteration of the ring. Honestly, looking at all four, I'm really impressed in general with the work of the developers on this one. There are some definite differences, of course. Tree placement varies between them, the types of trees used are all very different, the replication of the scenery, it's all unique in its own way, but the fact that we could see a track replicated so beautifully back in 2005, or even earlier in PGR2's case, is pretty awesome. So for the audience watching this video then, which of the four do you feel is the victor in capturing the essence of the Nürburgring? Be sure to let me know in comments or on social media. What you see here is what was once considered true state-of-the-art. As for GT4 itself, well, it was a huge success for the series, but ultimately looking back, the size and scope of the game is probably at least partially responsible for the troubled development that the next entry would see, Gran Turismo 5 on PlayStation 3. The need to match this amount of content while increasing the fidelity so much is a difficult thing. So, what happened with Gran Turismo after GT4? Let's briefly run down the situation. Well, first, when PlayStation Portable was revealed, Yamauchi himself announced a portable version of GT4 for PSP, but this release was delayed for many years before arriving on the market in 2009. It's a beautiful iteration of Gran Turismo though, with a huge range of tracks all translated over to portable form. It runs at 60 frames per second, features an option to install the game on your memory stick for quick loading, and even features a rudimentary form of TAA. It's a very unique game in that sense, but it's slightly let down by the fact that the progression system from prior GT games is not really present here. It's basically a bunch of single races that you can compete in to earn credits to buy more cars. It works well enough though for a portable game. In 2006, Polyphony unleashed another sim racing game on the world, this time focused on motorbikes, Tourist Trophy. It's derived from the work done on GT4 using that same engine, but with a focus on bike racing instead, and honestly, it's really good. We don't have enough time to cover this game in full for this episode, but it's out there. Later that year then, alongside the launch of PlayStation 3, Polyphony unleashed Gran Turismo HD. This is a small demo featuring one track and is basically a PS3 conversion of GT4's graphic engine, but with some minor improvements of course. Alongside Ridge Racer 7 though, GT HD is one of the few early PS3 games to run at a full HD 1080p at 60 frames per second, so it looked really nice at the time. Unfortunately, after this, the series would go into hibernation until the following year, where we would get GT5 Prologue, but we'd have to wait until 2010 for the actual release of Gran Turismo 5. The series would continue, of course, with GT6, GT Sport, and now 7, and in that sense, GT has never really left us, but it also never quite captured the feeling of those original games. The excitement around Gran Turismo and other racing games of that era cannot be understated. It was a very special time indeed. In fact, I really only scratched the surface here on many of the games mentioned in this episode, so be sure to let me know if you'd like to see further coverage of any of these titles or series, or cover some of the games I didn't get to include. Racing games are my passion, after all, and hopefully after this video, you've gained just a tiny bit of additional appreciation for classic digital motoring.
Hi everyone, I'm your best friend back in town again to get you on your dancing feet.
That sure was an adventure. I hope you enjoyed the trip as much as we did.